of course, this idea that nobody in Russia can have an opinion or everyone's telling you what to do. And you vouch for this. Nobody's ever told me what to say, think, or do here, ever. No,
Right.
never. Even I work in the media here, and well, as you say, I appeared on at the UN, and if I had done that for the Irish government when they were had a seat on the Security Council, or the British government, they would have gone through that speech that I was going to make with a tweezers. They would have managed every fractional part of that in case I annoyed somebody or said the wrong thing or offended somebody. Nobody in the Russian delegation that invited me to speak about the
no, they're not going to tell you what to do. And as a matter of fact, I wanted to let's talk about that. I because I admire your work so much, I was able to through a mutual friend be able to submit your name for the UN Security Council, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, about how that transpired, about like how you prepared and what that was like, your speech that you gave recently, because it was very powerful. You and Max Blumenthal were very, very it was really great. I'm sorry that the mainstream press suppressed it. It shouldn't be suppressed. It should be out there more. And so that's why I wanted to kind of highlight it a bit.
Yeah, well, thanks. It was, I suppose it's a huge platform, and it's an opportunity to reach out to people without this filter, which is
it becomes a historical record.
Yeah, I mean, what we said at the UN Security Council, it's interesting that everything we said at the UN Security Council, of everything we said, none of the British or American delegations, to the diplomatic delegations to the UN, challenged us on any of the factual issues that we raised. I raised several factual issues reported in the New York Times and the BBC, but I also raised issues around Ukraine's functionality as a state. What kind of country Ukraine is, what kind of country are American taxpayers being asked to pump tens of billions of their hard-earned taxpayers' dollars into. And I quote only from US State Department data, and one of the central pieces that I quoted from, Tara, was a report in 2019 where they basically said that Ukraine was a dysfunctional, lawless state, that judicial corruption was widespread.
It was the most corrupt country in the world at one time.
Well, essentially, yeah. I mean, and this is the US State Department. So, about judicial corruption, oppression of the opposition, corruption, endemic corruption, so that the country was basically incapable of functioning in any sort of validated sort of way in a Western democracy, that the opposition politicians and parties were being oppressed, imprisoned, killed, that people were being disappeared, violence against women. And what's very interesting as well was that they made a point of pointing out the violence, the targeted violence against LGBT individuals, people in Ukraine, that the state basically turned a blind eye to that targeted brutalization of people from these communities, that violence against women was endemic, that freedom of the press was basically non-existent, that the state controlled the media, and that the state basically was imprisoning its political opponents. So fast forward basically 2 years, and you've got a country which is being portrayed as the bastion and the center of all liberal democratic freedom, and that the American people are expected to, while 40 million of their co-Americans, if you like, or their co-taxpayers are living in poverty, huge problems with immigration, with social disharmony.
I wanted to show just a bit of your speech at the UN Security Council. If you could play that, please, Reade.
I now give the floor to Mr. Chay Bows.
Well, thank you for asking me to appear, ladies and gentlemen and chairman. And despite well over a year of frenzied and what is now recognized as loosely regulated supply of incalculable numbers of weapons to Ukraine, sources within the country still maintain that it needs an escalating volume of heavy and light weapons and ammunition to conduct its operations. Weapons being supplied by NATO and their allies to Ukraine are being willfully targeted against civilian populations on a daily basis in Donbass, Lugansk, Belgorod, all miraculously invisible to the Western media.
So, one thing that really strikes me about what you said, and for those that are watching, please check out his whole speech because it was very powerful. It got a lot of
floor to Mr.
In fact, Russian Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky stated that both Chay's speech and Max Blumenthal's speech were some of the best he had heard in his career, and that was a high compliment from him. He was very impressed with what you had to say, Chay. And of course, Max as well. But this brings us to this present moment, because you brought up those good points about the weapons and the damage it's doing to any hope of lasting speech or diplomacy to come down. And just today, Jake Sullivan announced with Karine, what's her name? Same Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary.
Clown Pierre, I like to call her.
Whatever, Clown Pierre. That they are going to allow more than what was expected of cluster bombs, and those cluster bombs are outlawed by 10 nations. And I think it's an average of 4 out of 7 are duds, and so that causes damage to civilians and children. Because you have a lot of those, because you have this bomb and then boom, it explodes into 100 tiny bombs, but then if it doesn't, it's a dud, then it can be found by a civilian or a child. That's why these are banned. So could you talk a little bit and educate the audience about just how awful the fact that the US is doing this? Because this is, in my opinion, it's horrendous that this is coming down the pike.
Yeah, well, I mean, this was the core of what we were talking to the UN about, which was this insanity of flooding Ukraine with very exceptionally portable weapons. On one occasion in my speech, I mentioned on one afternoon, 6 kilometers from the center of Kiev, the Zelensky regime handed out 18,000 automatic weapons to the population. Absolutely no training required. Turn up, show any form of ID, and you got a Kalashnikov rifle, as much ammunition as you could carry, grenades, handguns, pistols, 18,000. And this is all verified by the Ukrainian government. The saturation of Ukrainian society with these weapons is unprecedented. We're already seeing them filtering into Europe, into gangland. They're already turning up. There's anecdotal evidence that during the unrest in France, some of these weapons were used against French police. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated that Western anti-tank weapons that were supplied to Ukraine are now on the borders of Israel, ready to be deployed against Israeli tanks by the enemies of Israel. That's why he's not going to send any more weapons. The Bulgarian Prime Minister in the last 2 days said, we're not sending any more weapons into Ukraine because it's exceptionally corrupt and it's going to end up, on the periphery of one of our airports. I mean, this is anecdotal. I mean, Stinger missiles, which were flooded into Ukraine, one of those can take down an airliner full of anybody on any European airport. There's no air defense systems there. So this was the rationale of our discussion. How does flooding the most corrupt country on earth with exceptionally portable and valuable and saleable weapons end a conflict? We're not talking about heavy weapons, the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of artillery rounds. And now what you mentioned, Tara, is the provision by a desperate Biden regime. And remember, this is probably the 7th or 8th game changer that's going to be sent to Ukraine. It began with helmets and body armor. Then it began with Javelin anti-tank missiles. They were going to stop the Russians. It was going to end the war. Then it was the M777 howitzer, which was going to destroy the Russians. Didn't happen. And then it was, heavy vehicles, heavy artillery, rocket systems. Then it was, of course, the tanks, the Leopards. The Leopards were going to be released. Release the Leopards. Paul Massaro and these fantasists, these think tank sort of fetishists like McFaul and Massaro. The Leopards are burning. The Bradley vehicles are burning. The missiles are being shot down. Russia has the best anti-aircraft system ever developed in history, the S-400. and it's about to sort of commission into service the S-500, which can destroy an F-16 fighter, 500 kilometers away. So Ukraine can't win this war. It's a factual strategic impossibility. Nobody with an independent strategic or military education could in any way defend a position where they say it could. The Ukrainian army has been long defeated. The Ukrainian army trained by NATO between 2014 and 2022 is under the ground, unfortunately. Over 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. Their material, equipment, their Soviet-era tanks, air defense systems have all been burned. Now this is basically what started as NATO assisting Ukraine in a proxy war against Russia is now Ukraine supplying badly trained manpower to a second-rate NATO-supplied military to throw themselves against these prepared Russian defenses in the east. This, remember, 6 months ago, the Ukrainian high command were saying that within 2 weeks they would be at Melitopol. They would be cutting through the Russian defenses. We're a month plus now into this debacle of a counteroffensive. The losses of the Ukrainian military are astonishingly high. Remember, the Ukrainian government has made it illegal to report on the losses of the Ukrainian military. It's banned the opposition. It's banned a language. It's oppressed a religion. It's imprisoning journalists, and it's been doing that for a long time. It's prosecuting its own prosecutors in this faux anti-corruption move. This is the kind of country that the United States would have invaded if the people weren't white. So you got to understand that the fantasy narrative that Ukraine is winning and will win helps only one group of people, and that's the Russian military, which is sucking in these advancing hordes of conscripted Ukrainian boys and men who are dying in their thousands. For what? For this mirage of being brought into NATO. Today, it was made very clear that Ukraine will never join NATO in what it's engaged in a conflict with Russia. It's also been made very clear that Ukraine will never join the EU until there's massive economic reform. And it's also been made very clear that, the only interest the West has, organizations like BlackRock and these predatory commercial interests, the only interest they have in Ukraine is to make profit. And the military-industrial complex of which Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, is an ex-board member of Raytheon. I mean, come on. I mean,